Hi everyone, and welcome back to Rough Rider, where every week I talk writing, self-publishing, and living in a barely literate society. So antagonists are an integral part of any story. Without one, your hero doesn't get a chance to shine. But just like any character, you want the bad guy to be believable and interesting to your reader. So here are 5 tips for writing compelling villains you'll love to hate. The first tip for writing an effective villain is to give them backstory. Most bad guys aren't born bad. They turn to evil because of personal experience. Whether these experiences are part of a cycle of abuse or just negative experiences that they had throughout their youth or their early life, these are the kinds of things that turned them to evil. Backstory will explain their current behavior and motivations. I made a video about this in the past, so I put a link in the description for that. So when you start drafting up your novel, you should write a character profile not just for your protagonist, but also for the antagonist. I also made a video about that, so there's a link in the description for that also. You should come up with a list of events that had a lasting detrimental effect on the villain. You know, in my book, Devils in Sunday Hats, the main villain for one of the main characters is Gabe Skinner, and he's like a white trash, drug addict, abusive guy. But he didn't start out that way. He was born into a family that was very dysfunctional, substance abusing, verbally abusive towards their kids. He grew up dirt poor, was surrounded by bad behavior, and this is all he knew, this is all he saw, and then ultimately when he went to school, he was bullied by his peers, and that just really solidified everything for him. So if you write down a list of the things that happened to your villain, either again in their childhood, their young adult life, or even later on when they were an adult, the kinds of things that stuck with them, things that they really can't move on from or they haven't moved on from and haven't addressed, these are the kinds of things that transform them into what they are today. By giving the reader some insight into how the villain turned out to be so mean and so evil will make them more likely to be invested in that character. It'll just make them a lot more believable. They just won't be evil for no reason. So ultimately, backstory, like for any character, will create depth and create realism, and that's what you're going for. Now, my second tip for writing an effective villain is to show how they think. So backstory might explain how their mindset came about, but then you want to show that mindset and that way of thinking in the present. Most evil people probably don't think that they are evil. If anything, most of them probably think that they're doing the right thing, or at the very least that their evil behavior, which they might not perceive as evil, is justifiable or excusable in some way. But maybe they really do think that they're doing good, because the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You should try to establish the villain's mindset through either dialogue or point of view scenes. This really depends on your story. If you want the villain to ever be shown as a point of view character, to show things from their perspective, but it could just be dialogue with the main character or with their henchmen or something like that that will explain how they're thinking. Let the reader see that maybe they're not doing these evil things just for the sake of being evil. Their self-awareness just might be tragically skewed. Like in the Aetherverse, my sci-fi novel, the bad guys are constantly saying that what they're doing is for the greater good. But the reader can see that this is just a delusion. Everything they're doing is damaging, is immoral, but they think that they're doing it for this greater cause, for this ultimate ideal, and they don't care what happens along the way as long as they reach that fictional utopia that they're going for. Ultimately, they'll never build that utopia because it's impossible, but they think that they can. So show the reader what's going on in the villain's head. And again, you could do that through dialogue or through directly showing them as a point of view character. You don't necessarily have to have them be a point of view character throughout the entire story. Like in my book, Devils in Sunday Hats, Gabe Skinner is only a point of view character for one scene. The rest of the book he's not. But it's in that one scene that I really dive both into his backstory and how he's thinking in the current moment. And my third tip for writing an effective villain is to let them win sometimes. Readers expect the hero to win in the end. It's almost always like that. But there should be room for some doubt that the protagonist will succeed in the end. Readers are going to stay interested in the story if the villain wins some of those battles. The hero might win the war in the end, but along the way, they should lose occasionally. Otherwise, there's no reason to watch this fight. It just seems like an unfair fight where the villain is just always going to lose, they're incompetent, or the hero just constantly gets the better of them. That gets boring. You have to make the struggle real and worth watching. Now, if you're writing a series of books, then the villain can win at the end of at least one of those books in the series. You'd use this as a cliffhanger, and I think that's a really effective way of utilizing a victory on the part of the villain to keep the reader reading. So by the end of the book, the hero might come out on top, but they should be sweaty, they should be beaten and bloody by the end. That's what made it worth reading, because you didn't know if that was going to turn out that way. What I'm saying is you don't want the villain to constantly lose. You don't want the hero to constantly win. You want to have a balance of these two, and by the end is when the protagonist emerges victorious. And my fourth tip for writing effective villains is to make them a little likable. I always think of Disney villains when I think of just a really interesting villain. They do a really good job of making them sort of alluring, maybe even likable. When I was a kid, I always loved Ursula. I didn't realize it was basically a drag queen back then. And then even Hades from Hercules is just a great character. He's like a sleazy salesman, and he's funny, and it's really effective. You'll be disgusted by their evil plans, but then at the same time, there's something about them that really draws you in. Evil can be seductive. It's not always just this scary, scary thing. It's something that draws you in some way. Otherwise, people wouldn't turn to evil. And Disney does this by really well-written dialogue. They tend to add an element of humor to their villains, and that's what really captures the audience's attention. And you may not necessarily want your villain to be outright funny, but if you just have some little comedic elements to their speech, whether it's just biting sarcasm or just some personal flair that really makes them distinct, then that will make your readers that much more interested in the villain. You can have this dialogue be between the villain and the protagonist. It could be between the villain and their own henchmen. However you decide to do it, by showing them have some witty dialogue, saying some, even if it's just once or twice, having like a good one-liner will really help make them a more magnetic kind of character. The reader might still hate what they're doing, but some part of them deep down, like that dark, kind of morbidly curious part of them, will maybe want the villain to win a little bit. And I don't mean that they should be rooting for the villain, but they should have some sort of morbid curiosity about what might happen if the villain did win, if their evil plans were to succeed. And to accomplish this, you should give them an interesting personality. And I think that a little bit of humor goes a long way with that. Now, my fifth tip for writing effective villains is to find common ground with the reader. Everyone is capable of unspeakably evil things. I think a really big problem in our culture right now is we have this assumption that people are inherently good, that only a small number of people would ever really cave into the temptations of evil. By saying that, you're denying human nature. It's in human nature to be violent, to be selfish, to be greedy, to be aggressive. And if anything, that just makes the people who are not caving into those things that much more admirable. And there's a really interesting experiment that was done, I think in the 70s. It was the Stanford prison experiment. They wrote a book about it called The Lucifer Effect. And basically what they did was they took two groups of people, they designated some of them as guards and some of them as prisoners. They put them in basically a fake prison. And then over the course of several days, the guards were given more and more perceived authority. So they started out as good people. By the end, when they had been given this kind of authority, they were completely unrecognizable. They were abusing the designated prisoners. They were engaging in these horrible acts, and they had to cut the experiment short. That experiment ultimately showed that good people can turn bad under the right set of circumstances, and it doesn't matter who you are. So like I was saying earlier, your villain probably didn't start out evil. It was a series of experiences and situations that turned them into that evil mastermind. And they'll be a much more compelling character if the reader can see themselves in them. If you can help the reader relate to them, and I don't mean to create sympathy for the villain necessarily, but I mean to hold a mirror up to the reader's face and really make them uncomfortable. Make them see that this could happen to them too under the right set of circumstances. Don't let your reader get away with thinking that they themselves are a purely good person. This can happen to anyone. And like I just said, that will make the reader a little uncomfortable, but it'll be sort of a revelatory thing. And when they realize that they too could potentially, just like anyone, end up this way, end up bad, end up mean, end up nasty, that will make the villain that much more captivating to them. Maybe a little disturbing, but captivating. So when you're writing indie fiction, having an interesting, believable villain is a really, really important element of storytelling. Your novel is not going to keep a reader's attention without a captivating antagonist and without an eventful, unpredictable sort of struggle between good and evil. A compelling backstory, clear motivations, and just an interesting personality is really going to go a long way in getting your reader to be invested not just in the protagonist of your story, but also in the antagonist. So if you want to read a little bit more about this, I do have a blog post about writing villains. You can find the link in the description. I talk a little bit more about how I did this in my own books. And if you found this interesting or helpful, please like and subscribe, follow me on social media, and as always, thank you for watching. God bless.